Today's trip, you will hear this sound. That will alert you to listen.
On spring, summer, and fall Saturdays in South Georgia, there's only one way to explore the birthplace of Jimmy Carter.
As we begin today's trip, we would like to direct your attention to a few rules.
It's a step back in time, as they say, on Georgia's rolling state park. The Savannah, Americus, and Montgomery, or SAM, short line train runs all sorts of special events and excursions throughout the year. But the Presidential Flyer is their signature route and their most popular ticket. Departing from Cordele, Georgia, close to I-75, the ride does feel like a step back in time as you leave modern city life behind, riding through groves of loblolly pines and across the waters of Lake Blackshear. Depending on the schedule, the Sam Short Line might make stops in Archery at Carter's boyhood home, Americus, where he attended college, and of course at the depot in downtown Plains, where he launched his presidential campaign. Carter was born in Plains and still lives there today. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I want to invite you to take this ride with me and learn more about President Jimmy Carter's life and legacy.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
The time for racial discrimination is over.
that I will faithfully execute
An undiminished, ever expanding American dream.
the office of President of the United States
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
and will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence.
preserve, protect, and defend
To remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I've had.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
If you're in Plains, Georgia, and you want to know more about President Jimmy Carter, there's one person you need to ask.
I'm Jill Stuckey, and I'm the superintendent of Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. My late husband was a fundraiser for candidate Carter back in the 70s. I married my husband in 1995. We were dating in 1994, and I was a huge Carter fan, so he arranged for a meeting, and I've basically been working with them ever since.
If you had a classroom of middle schoolers in the state history class here in Georgia and they were visiting the facility and you were introducing them to Plains, introducing them to where Carter grew up, how would you start that narrative?
So President and Mrs. Carter were both born here in Plains. President Carter was the first president to be born in a hospital because his mother was working there. Basically, nobody was born in a hospital back in 1924 when he was born. But his mother was very pregnant. She came to the doctor while she was at work at the hospital and said, "I think I'm having my baby." So he said, "Well, instead of going home, let's just, go in a room and we'll have it here." So that's a typical trivia question that is asked. But President Carter was born, like I say, here in Plains. The Smith family, Rosalind Carter Smith's family, was next door. And when Rosalind was born, little 3-4-year-old Jimmy went next door and peeked into the bassinet and first laid eyes on his wife. But the Carters had a typical life here in Plains. They were farmers. His father was a very good businessman. He had stores and was in the peanut industry and agriculture industry. And so little Jimmy worked on the farm. They moved out to Archery, Georgia, which was a few miles outside of town. And they were surrounded by tenant farmers. These were African-American farmers that were Jimmy's best friends. He grew up with these people. And I think that's why President Carter, to this day, appreciates, works with African Americans, tries to help African Americans have equality as much as he does.
Yeah, he's talked about that really openly in public, how much that experience shaped him. Can you share a little bit more on that? What are some of his favorite stories that he likes to share about growing up and the experience of growing up in the racially segregated American South?
Jimmy really didn't realize there was too much of a difference when he was very young, till the days when he started going into town and he started realizing on the train there were different places for him to ride and his black friends to ride. And he tells the story when he was 14 years old that they were all playing in the field. They were running up to this gate, and all the other black children stopped to let him go through first. And he thought, oh, there's a tripwire or something. But what had happened, their parents had told them that Jimmy was now a man. He was of age, so they had to start treating him differently. So they stopped and let Jimmy go through, and that really stuck in his mind.
You mentioned Jimmy coming of age. What did that look like? Growing up through the Depression, and then as he was a teenager, it was about the time of World War II. What was that experience like for him?
Times were tough then, but Jimmy was very savvy in business. So Jimmy would harvest peanuts and boil them, go down on the streets of Plains, which was a busy mercantile place when he was young. He would set up and sell the peanuts, and he got enough money to buy some old rickety houses, which he fixed up and rented. And he was very early on very much business savvy and wanted to be self-sustaining even at teenage years.
The self-sustaining part is probably not unfamiliar to a student of Carter or just a student of history that kind of knows about that image that was cultivated for him as a president. But the business savvy part, maybe less so. He was always kind of known as the peanut farmer from Plains, but he was much more than that. Talk a little bit about those late teen years leaving public school here in Plains and the college years and his career that followed.
He graduated after the 11th grade because back in the day, there was only 11 grades here in Plains. So he got out of school, went to college first in Americas, and then from there went to Georgia Tech, and then from there got the appointment to the Naval Academy. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 3 years. He was on a ship and a submarine and loved the seas, loved traveling, didn't like being away from Roseland and the family too much, but he was very dedicated to serving his country and helping every way he could.
Let's talk a little bit about that romance between Jimmy and Roseland. What age did they start to develop a courtship, and how did that relationship progress into the lifelong marriage that it's become?
There was 3 years difference. And as you know, when you're kids, 3 years is a long time. So he really didn't know Roseland to speak of when he was in high school. But he came home from the military academy, and his girlfriend had a family reunion. So he was kind of looking for somebody to spend the weekend with. And Roseland was good friends with Jimmy's sister. And Roseland likes to tell the story. She actually fell in love with Jimmy's picture in her best friend's bedroom, the picture of Jimmy in the Naval Academy. So they went out, and Jimmy came home that night from the date and told his mother, I met the girl I'm going to marry. But Roseland was a little bit hard to get because she had promised her father before he died that she would finish college. So he asked her a few times to marry him before she finally said yes. But they got married. They went to Chimney Rock for their honeymoon. We were talking about that the other day, and it put a big smile on both their faces to talk about their honeymoon trip to the mountains. But they have been partners and just about inseparable ever since.
You can't talk about the beauty of the love story without also talking about their children and, of course, now grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But tell us a little bit about their kids.
So a lot of people come here to Jimmy Carter Historical Park and they only think that the Carters had one child, which they actually had 4 children. They had 3 boys. And then President Carter likes to say, we had a 13-year argument and then we had Amy. So Amy grew up basically in the governor's mansion and in the White House. The boys and the family are very, very essential to the Carters. They spend a lot of time with their family. Every year they go on vacation. They would take everybody in their family. They would take their 4 children. They would take their children and grandchildren and go any place in the world that the family wanted to go and spend a week, in the week between Christmas and New Year's. And they would be at the Carter Center a lot. 3 of the 4 children live in metropolitan Atlanta. So they would have dinners every month at the Carter Center, or more often. They would go visit their children. The children come here to Plains, just, like a typical family. They love each other and want to be with each other.
Like a typical family, just with the Secret Service escort.
Exactly.
You mentioned that we're here at the historical site. Tell us a little bit about all of the facilities that are around that are connected to Carter. It's a relatively rural part of southern Georgia, and it's indelibly linked now to Jimmy Carter and his legacy and the prestige of being the birthplace of a president. So there's lots of historical places around. As much as you can paint a picture with words, describe all the things that you could see if you want to come to Plains and the surrounding area and learn about President Carter.
The Park Service has 4 sites here. We have the building we're in, which is a 100-year-old schoolhouse that the Carters attended grades 1 through 11. We have the depot in downtown Plains, which is where President Carter started his campaign for president. We have President Carter's boyhood farm, where he moved to in 1928 when he was 4 years old and stayed there till he was 17, till he went to college. And then we actually have the Carter's house and the area where they will be buried, right in front of their house. So when the Carters are both deceased, many, many years from now, the Park Service will take over the house and turn it into, hopefully, a museum so people can walk in and see the house that the Carters built in 1961, where they still live today, which is very surprising to a lot of people that somebody of President and Mrs. Carter's stature would live in the same house that they built in 1961. It's a 3-bedroom ranch house, just a typical house that would have been built in the 1960s. There's nothing fancy about it. Anwar Sadat walked into the house and looked around and said, well, where's the main house? This is it. They are not pretentious people. They haven't upgraded the kitchen or the bathroom. It's just like it was. It's good enough for them. They don't need anything fancy. They like to put their money and their work into focusing on helping others instead of making their surroundings fancy.
Let's talk a little bit about that work. You mentioned the Carter Center. A lot of the humanitarian work that the Carters do is done under the auspices, obviously, of the Carter Center. I'm especially interested to hear, how is that work received and interpreted locally here? When you talk about Carter in town, in a rural southern area, how is Carter talked about and remembered? How is that legacy filtered in real time?
There's basically 2 different sides. There's people that think pretty much everything he did was wonderful and is doing is wonderful. And there are people that just don't like him at all. A little bit about what they have done since they left the presidency. So they started the Carter Center very early on, and the Carter Center does work on a few different areas. They work with fair and open elections and making sure that people have the ability to vote for candidates that they want and choose. They do a lot with mental health. That's what Rosalind has focused on in most of her career. And then they're eradicating and eliminating diseases. So there are literally hundreds of millions of people that aren't blind or don't have worms growing out of their body due to the work of the Carters. It's funny, I went to church with the Carters when he was teaching Sunday school. A few times I would get to talk before President Carter came on, and, there'd be 400 people in there. And I'd say, okay, what has President Carter been doing since he's no longer president? And all the hands go up in the room and they say, Habitat for Humanity. And don't get me wrong, Habitat for Humanity is phenomenal. They're a great organization. But I say, yeah, they do that 1 week out of the year. What do they do the other 51 weeks out of the year? And here again, it's a case where the Carters don't blow their own horn. They quietly go about doing their work without a lot of fanfare. But when they build a house, they get a lot of attention. They're working with folks like Garth and Tricia, and they're doing a lot of it here in this country. So it's on TV and radio, and that's what people know about them. But there's a lot more about the Carters if you just look a little further beneath the surface.
As someone who is in charge of running a historical site, you have a lot of interaction with people from the public that come in, want to visit. And so you get to hear that wide range of views about Carter. What are some of the most common conceptions of who Carter was as a president? And you mentioned some as a post-president. And what are some of the ones that you would really characterize as misconceptions that you think that either the historical record got wrong or the media got wrong, but they're just ones that you notice that people come in again and again and kind of repeat a certain narrative, and maybe that narrative is incorrect?
So, a lot of people come in and say, oh, he's a good ex-president, which really, they don't know the true history. And a lot of the true history is coming out now. So there's a lot of misconceptions in history, but I think the record is being corrected in a lot of cases now. There's been some books that have come out that have really spotlighted these misconceptions, and people were starting to take another look at his presidency. For the most part, these have all been very favorable perceptions that have come out.
Why don't we end up by talking about some of those favorable aspects? What do you think are some of the key aspects of his legacy, whether part of the presidency or part of the post-presidency, that are the most important things for someone to know about who Carter is and what he's achieved?
The Middle East peace treaty that still has not been broken between Begin and Sadat was huge. Doubling the size of the National Park Service was huge. And I think had we listened to him on his energy policy, he had put into place a way that we could be totally energy independent by the year 2000. Had we done that, the next administration did away with those policies. But just think where we would be if we would have been totally independent with our energy by the year 2000. I think we'd be in a lot better place. Developing or creating the Department of Education, the Department of Energy were huge. What he has done afterwards and what he is still doing with the Carter Center, with Habitat for Humanity, and now he has started what is called the Carter Plains Foundation, where he is trying to eradicate substandard housing in Plains. So Carter Plains Foundation has put about 17 new roofs on houses in Plains, about 14 new HVAC systems, has bettered the lives of a number of people right here in Plains, where he kind of sticks around here these days. So wherever he is going to help people. That's one of both their mottos, because they are true partners.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.